It was a late September afternoon, the kind where the sun hangs low and golden across the backyard, making everything feel warmer than it actually is. I was in the kitchen, washing the last of the dishes from breakfast, a ritual I always found strangely meditative, when I heard the faint crunch of tires against the gravel driveway. I looked up and saw a familiar car pull in. My husband, Mark, had mentioned earlier that his business partner, Tom, might stop by unexpectedly, but I hadn't expected him today. Tom was someone I had always admired from a distance. He carried a calm authority about him, not in an overbearing way, but in a manner that made you feel immediately at ease. We'd shared polite conversations at company events, mostly small talk about work, golf, or the occasional neighborhood gathering. I never imagined we'd have a moment where anything deeply personal would come into play. Mark greeted him warmly, the kind of handshake that tells you these two have history and mutual respect. I watched from the kitchen doorway as they exchanged a few jokes, laughter spilling lightly into the warm afternoon air. I joined them a few minutes later with a tray of iced tea and freshly baked scones. Tom's smile was genuine, the kind that reaches your eyes and leaves you feeling welcomed. We settled in the living room, sunlight pooling across the soft beige carpet and the framed family photos that lined the shelves. Tom started talking about the usual things: work deadlines, new projects, some mundane office politics, but then there was a subtle shift in his tone. Something softened, and his eyes, for a brief moment, seemed to hold a story waiting to be told. Mark excused himself to take a phone call, leaving Tom and me alone. I could feel the tension lift slightly, though I wasn't sure why. There was a quiet in the room that encouraged honesty. Tom looked around, noticing the small details of our home, the way the sunlight hit the books on the shelf, the soft hum of the ceiling fan. It was almost as if he was grounding himself, preparing to speak. Then, very gently, he began to share a part of himself that I had never imagined. It wasn't a dramatic revelation, not the kind you see in movies, but something profoundly human. He spoke of his father, a man who had been distant and stern, and how that had shaped his approach to life and work. He talked about the loneliness he had felt moving from city to city for his career, the kind of loneliness that doesn't often have words. His voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of vulnerability that I couldn't ignore. I found myself leaning forward, listening more intently than I had expected. There was a gentle honesty in the way he spoke, a desire not to impress, but simply to connect. I realized that for the first time, I wasn't seeing Tom as Mark's business partner. I was seeing him as a person, a man who had carried silent burdens, yet still managed to show up for the people in his life. I shared a bit of my own story in return, not to compare pain, but to create a bridge between us. I spoke of my mother, who had passed away a few years earlier, and the quiet gaps she left behind in my daily life. I spoke about the comfort I found in routines, in the small acts of care that often go unnoticed. Tom listened, nodding, his expressions softening with each word. The room seemed smaller, more intimate, though it was the same familiar space I had walked through every day. There was a quiet understanding forming between us, a recognition of shared humanity. Time slipped by unnoticed, and I found myself wishing Mark wouldn't come back just yet, though I knew he would. The conversation had opened something unexpected, a space for empathy that neither of us anticipated when the visit began. When Mark finally returned, Tom smiled at me in a way that acknowledged the moment we had shared. I smiled back, a little embarrassed but also comforted by the simple human connection. The three of us continued our conversation, but there was a new layer now, a subtle warmth that lingered in the room long after Tom had left. I realized as I watched him drive away, the sun dipping lower into the horizon, that sometimes people reveal truths not to shock or impress, but simply to be seen. And in that recognition, I felt a quiet sense of gratitude, for honesty, for openness, and for the unexpected ways human connections can deepen. It was a day that began like any other and ended with a feeling of gentle revelation. I think sometimes we expect moments of understanding to arrive with grand gestures or dramatic confessions, but often they come softly, quietly, in the middle of ordinary afternoons. After Tom's visit, the house felt different. Not in any visible way. The furniture hadn't changed, the sunlight still streamed through the same windows, but the air seemed heavier with a kind of quiet reflection. Mark was oblivious to it at first. He had returned to his usual routine, checking emails and making phone calls, but I found myself lingering by the living room window, staring at the driveway long after it was empty. The days following that afternoon were filled with a strange mix of normalcy and reflection. I kept replaying Tom's words in my mind, his voice gentle, unhurried, as if he had carefully chosen each phrase. I couldn't stop thinking about the stories he shared, small, intimate revelations about his life that he had never voiced before. It was remarkable, the trust he placed in me, a stranger in his eyes, yet someone who shared a connection to the man he knew in business. One evening, a week later, Mark mentioned that Tom would be visiting again, this time to go over some paperwork and strategy for a new project. My first reaction was hesitation. I wasn't sure I wanted to relive that intensity of conversation, and yet there was a curiosity that tugged at me. I wanted to know more about the person behind the polite professionalism. When Tom arrived that Friday, the day was overcast, with clouds drifting lazily across the sky. He stepped inside and immediately noticed a vase of fresh lilies on the dining table. "They smell wonderful," he said, and I could hear genuine appreciation in his voice. It was such a simple thing, yet it made the room feel warmer. Mark left us alone again to go make a call, and I found myself sitting across from Tom at the dining table, the hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the wall clock creating a quiet rhythm around us. We talked about work at first, projects, deadlines, logistics, but gradually the conversation drifted. It always did. Tom had a way of steering dialogue from facts and figures to observations about life without it feeling abrupt. He began telling me about his childhood home, a small town in Ohio where the seasons seemed to stretch endlessly. He spoke of the smell of wood smoke in winter, the long summer evenings spent catching fireflies, and the laughter that would echo in the kitchen as his family prepared dinner. There was a nostalgia in his words, a longing for something that was simple yet deeply cherished. I realized that for the first time, I was seeing him not just as my husband's colleague, but as a man shaped by memories, losses, and the small joys that often go unnoticed. I shared my own memories in return, the summers I spent at my grandparents' lake house, the quiet mornings in the garden where I had first discovered a love for flowers, the evenings by the fireplace with Mark when our children were young. Our stories wove together, sometimes overlapping, sometimes diverging, but always with a gentle rhythm that felt natural. There was a moment when he paused mid-sentence, looking out the window at the gathering clouds. "I don't usually share these things," he said quietly, almost hesitantly. "I'm not sure why I feel like I can with you." His eyes met mine, steady and sincere, and I realized he was trusting me with a piece of himself he rarely revealed to anyone. I reached for the cup of tea I had poured for him, and without thinking I said, "I'm honored that you do." The words felt simple, but I meant every one of them. There was a stillness in that room, a pause that seemed to stretch long enough for both of us to breathe deeply and absorb the moment. As the afternoon faded into evening, the sky shifting from gray to a soft amber, we talked about the future, our hopes, our regrets, and the lessons we had learned along the way. There was no pressure, no expectation, just an honest exchange of thoughts and feelings that left me feeling unexpectedly lighter, as if sharing these moments had released a tension I hadn't realized I was carrying. Mark eventually returned, his voice breaking the gentle hush of the room, but the warmth of the connection lingered. I could tell from the subtle change in Tom's demeanor that our conversation had left its mark. He was quieter, more reflective, yet somehow more present, fully engaged in the simple joys of being in a home, among people he respected and trusted. That night, after Tom had gone, I sat in the living room with a blanket over my lap, the amber light of the sunset casting long shadows across the furniture. I thought about trust, about the courage it takes to reveal personal truths, and about the quiet power of being heard. It struck me that sometimes the most profound connections aren't forged in grand gestures, but in the delicate balance of listening and sharing, of seeing someone as they truly are and allowing yourself to be seen in return. For the first time in a long while, I felt an unexpected sense of gratitude. Not for anything material, but for the simple fact that people can surprise us, that life can offer moments of unexpected depth and clarity when we least expect them. And though the visit had ended, the impact remained, quietly shaping the way I viewed not just Tom, but the world around me, in shades that were richer, warmer, and more human. The weeks after Tom's second visit brought a new rhythm to our home. I noticed small changes in myself, subtle shifts in how I observed the world. Mornings seemed brighter, not because the sun had changed, but because I felt more attuned to the quiet details, the way the light hit the kitchen counter, the sound of birds outside the window, the gentle hum of life moving steadily forward. One Saturday, Mark had to go out of town for a business conference, leaving the house quiet for the first time in months. I was sitting on the porch, a cup of coffee warming my hands, when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, but there was Tom, standing on the porch with a bag of freshly baked bread in his hands. "I thought you might like these," he said, offering a small smile. There was no explanation, no pretense, just a simple gesture of kindness. I invited him in, and we moved to the living room, settling into the same chairs we had sat in during our previous conversations. There was a familiarity now, a comfort that made talking feel natural, effortless. We began with light conversation, commenting on the weather, on the latest news, and on the small changes in the garden. But as the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, his tone shifted slightly, a quiet seriousness settling over him. "I've been thinking," he began, "about the way we live our lives, how often we hold back parts of ourselves because we're afraid of judgment or misunderstanding." He paused, as if weighing his words. "I've realized that being honest, truly honest, is rarer than I thought, even with people you care about." I listened, feeling the weight of his words resonate deeply. There was a softness to his voice, a vulnerability that demanded attention, not in a dramatic, overwhelming way, but in a quiet, steady manner that invited empathy. I nodded, encouraging him to continue. He spoke of the pressures of maintaining a certain image in business, of always appearing strong, decisive, capable. He admitted that these expectations often left him feeling isolated, that he longed for someone to simply understand without needing to offer solutions or advice. His admission was neither boastful nor sorrowful. It was matter-of-fact, a candid glimpse into a part of his life few people had ever seen. I shared some of my own reflections in return, speaking about the masks we wear in different parts of our lives, the ways we hide insecurities beneath routines and responsibilities. I told him about my own moments of doubt, the quiet evenings when I questioned choices or felt the pang of loneliness that sometimes accompanies the middle years of life. There was a long pause, a silence filled with understanding rather than awkwardness. For the first time, I felt a profound connection not through words or shared history, but through the simple act of listening and being heard. It was remarkable how much strength and comfort could be found in honesty, in allowing another person to see your unguarded self without fear of judgment. As the day wore on, Tom and I drifted into more personal territory, discussing dreams that had been deferred, relationships that had evolved, and the ways in which we both sought meaning in the small, everyday acts of life. I realized that our conversations were slowly becoming something rare, a meeting of minds and hearts, built on mutual respect and a willingness to be open. Mark returned in the evening, tired but cheerful, and joined us for dinner. There was a subtle difference in the atmosphere. a warmth that lingered in the room, a sense that the bonds between us had deepened without being overtly acknowledged. I noticed Tom's relaxed posture, the ease in his voice, and I understood that our previous conversations had allowed him to feel more fully present in a space that was his own as much as ours. After Tom left that night, I stayed on the porch for a long time, watching the sky turn indigo and the first stars emerge. I thought about the unexpected turns life takes, about the people we encounter who reveal new dimensions of existence simply by being sincere and open. I reflected on my own journey, the ways in which listening had enriched me, made me more compassionate, more attentive, more appreciative of the simple truths that often go unnoticed. It struck me that life's most meaningful experiences don't always come with fanfare. They arrive quietly, subtly, through moments of honesty and connection. And though the day had ended, I carried with me a profound awareness of the gift of being seen, and the equally profound gift of seeing another person truly, without pretense. That night, as I finally climbed into bed, I realized that the most unexpected visits often leave the deepest impressions. They remind us of what matters: integrity, empathy, and the courage to reveal our inner worlds to others who will receive them with respect. And for the first time in a long while, I felt a serene sense of clarity, a quiet confidence that these human connections, fragile and fleeting as they may seem, are the very threads that make life meaningful. The weeks after Tom's third visit settled into a comfortable rhythm, though there was always an unspoken awareness of the quiet connection that had formed. Life, in its usual pace, carried on. Mark focused on work, I tended to the house, and the small routines that brought me comfort, but beneath the surface there was a lingering sense of depth in my daily experiences. One late afternoon, the sky painted in shades of peach and lavender, I found myself in the garden, pruning roses and arranging the small patch of herbs near the kitchen door. The scent of the earth, the warmth of the fading sun, and the soft rustle of leaves created a sense of calm I hadn't felt before. I thought about Tom, about the unexpected honesty he had shared, and about the quiet impact his presence had left on my perspective. That evening, Mark mentioned that Tom would be stopping by to finalize some details about a new partnership project. I wasn't nervous. I was curious. I wanted to see the man who had revealed so much of himself continue to navigate the world with the same authenticity, and perhaps even share a bit more of the quieter truths that often go unspoken. When Tom arrived, he carried the same gentle ease as before, a calmness that contrasted with the constant motion of the world outside our home. He complimented the flowers in the garden, commenting on the way the late sunlight softened the colors of the petals. I realized again that it wasn't just his words, but his awareness, the way he noticed the small, meaningful details that made him memorable. Mark excused himself briefly to take a call, leaving Tom and me alone once again. The room was quiet, save for the soft ticking of the wall clock, and I noticed the subtle way the shadows of the evening stretched across the floor. Without any preamble, Tom began speaking, not about work this time, but about his reflections on life, the paths we choose, and the unexpected lessons that arrive when we least anticipate them. "I've been thinking a lot about how we relate to one another," he said softly. "It's